Roberto Bottazzi. Roberto Bottazzi is an architect, a researcher, and an educator based in London. He is the director of the Master in Urban Design at the Bartlett UCL, and he has previously been teaching at the University of Westminster and at the Royal College of Art in London, amongst other universities. His research analyzes the impact of digital technologies on architecture and urbanism, and particularly how digital architecture is inscribed in a wider and longer history, which is proto-computational, and this he explores in his very recent book, Digital Architecture Beyond Computers, Fragments of a Cultural History of Computational Design, which was just published. And he has also been an editor of Walking Cities London, which was published last year. He has lectured and exhibited internationally, and particularly he has last year presented the installation Data Architecture in Milan. He has also widely contributed to the architectural debate by being an active reviewer for several publishing companies, among which Wiley, Bloomsbury's, and Routledge. Please join me in welcoming Roberto Bottazzi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Emmanuelle, for the introduction, and to Vera also for the invitation. Yes, my talk will concentrate quite directly, I think, on the themes of memotechnics and architecture. And I will move, let's say, a bit freely, if you like, between the contemporary condition and an historical one. The notes are not... the notes...
No.
All right, sorry for the technical problem. So, starting from the contemporary condition, as Emmanuelle was saying, my research deals with the role of digital tools in design, and particularly in the impact of what we now understand to be called big data. Yeah? By big data now, we don't necessarily mean just large data sets, massive data sets that exceeds basically our ability to mine them, but we also now include machine learning, that is algorithms that are able to substitute us basically in the process of categorization. So I think it's this continuous, these words are fairly, if you like, generic and quite trendy these days, but this kind of continuum between data and machine learning is really the object of the talk today. We know that the problem or the promise of this continuum between data and algorithm is the removal of compression, basically, as a cultural category from the way in which we operate. We know from Leibniz that compression is comprehension. And then the extraction of patterns has always been a central key in the manipulation of data for spatial purposes. Now, I think that the equivalent of the practical equivalent of compression, which remains a theoretical category, is that of efficiency, which is perhaps and optimization, which are perhaps the buzzwords that seem to be mapping, basically, or describing the current situation in the use of big data for design. So the questions that I'd like to pose is perhaps one in which we can problematize that relationship, we can go beyond perhaps the problem of optimizations, and perhaps to think of different paradigms to tune the relationship between data and space. And memotechnics is, of course, a subject that has been able to help, if you like, designers throughout history in this particular regard. This is also because of the increased automatization of our landscape, and with that, the consequence naturalization, if you like, of computation. That is, for a long time, the instruments of drawing emerged from, as we know, from many accounts of history of technology, emerged from a reification of human functions, basically, into tools, and the computer itself is, of course, an attempt to reconstruct a brain by other means. But with the automation of space, we now see that the paradigms of computation, which were abstract and artificial, have now become natural, if you like. That is, they have become the very paradigms that guide the development and the design of our own space. So automated factories, Amazon fulfillment centers, storage spaces are only perhaps the most evident examples of a process that is actually controlling pretty much the way in which our life is routinized and the way in which the built environment is experienced. With that, the historical or more traditional definition of memotechniques have become suddenly obsolete. Of course, the possibility to amass large data sets removes the problem of memory as an act of both remembering and forgetting at the same time. So both elements are no longer important, and therefore the problem of compression, which I was talking about earlier, takes a slightly different role and is no longer described through graphic representations of space, but rather through algorithmic representations of space. It's also interesting to talk about the finite world of data, which is more and more described as an infinite domain, where absolute knowledge, complete knowledge, infinite knowledge can be gathered. Of course, this is not the case at all. We know that databases are, by definition, finite collections of data, that they are highly structured, they are self-referential in order to be operable on. And I think in that shift, in fact, memotechniques as a field that emerged a long time ago still provides interesting ways of thinking about these conversations. So the problem becomes one of spatial distribution, yeah? One that is, of course, at the core of both fields I would like to address today, both architecture and memotechniques, and becomes a problem of management between randomness and patterns, and also one that one in which the relationship between distribution and space can be managed. There's also a flip side, or if you like, a slightly cloudier side to this world, which is, I think, the world of Cambridge Analytica, that I will not discuss today, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is not of relevance in this debate. What I'd like to talk about today, like I said, is more, let's say, its relationship to space, and I'd like to start from the idea that, of course, any changes in the technologies of description of space has always changed the way in which we can account the space, and therefore the way in which we can intervene with it. At the present time, of course, images like the one we have on the screen are the direct result of an ecology of technologies that are strung together in order to produce images of the Earth, which we have not been able to fully appreciate so far. It is, in fact, the very inhuman quality of computation that, again, Leibniz referred to as a promise behind the construction of machines for calculating. And this inhuman quality is now, of course, presenting itself to us through the ability to appreciate scales and time frames which have not been fully describable, and therefore could not be the object of design itself. So in this scene of large scale, or even as many refer to planetary computation, we have, for instance, the phenomenon of climate change, which is obviously a result of the fact that we have large machines able to crunch large data sets. We would not really have climate change without computers, and that can be read both ways, as in the direct sense of the immense use of resources necessary to propel planetary computation, but also the fact that through a mathematical description of data, we can actually appreciate certain natural phenomena. So as such, I think that the tension between abstraction and images remains a key element, and it is still part of the work of a designer. And the talk will try to problematize perhaps this relationship between abstraction and images. And also I'd like to think that the combination of all these subjects remain a subject that falls within the domain of design. So the visibility threshold can be perhaps considered at different levels, at the very large scale of the Earth, but also at the granular scale of microscopic deformation of the Earth crust due to either man-made intervention on it or broader geological phenomena unfolding. And that, between these two scales, I think an interesting agenda for design perhaps could emerge. There are endless examples of how the changes in the technological apparatus of description of the Earth have changed the way in which we understood our role and mode of intervention in it. Just one really that I'd like to draw your attention to are the Chrono files by Buckminster Fuller, a project that started around 1922, according to Fuller himself, and consists on basically an indexing of everything that took place in the life of the American polymath. The final result consists of 737 volumes, each ranging between 300 and 400 pages, containing just above 250,000 letters written by Fuller, but more in general, really containing every single activity that saw Fuller involved, from the mundane to the actual, perhaps more important notes about his work. It is a piece of archival history that is like no other, at least since it was developed prior to the invention of the modern digital computer, and it's one that allowed Fuller himself to reconsider his role as a designer. There are a number of claims he made over the analysis of his own Chrono files. One, for instance, was the increased ephemeralization of technology, its miniaturization over time. But to me, what begins to be quite interesting is that as a result of the possibilities at this point really only speculated rather than actually possible to gather data, a different image, if you like, of the Earth begins to be plotted. These images are gathered in a series of volumes that Fuller worked on in preparation for the World Game, this game that he had conceived for planetary planning, and in fact a game that was subtitled as a world peace game, a game that would have brought peace on the Earth. But more importantly here are, like I said, the scale and the time frames within which these data collections are now charted. Again, something that shifts basically the horizon of the designer. And again, playing between abstraction and images, Fuller himself began to devise a number of design objects at a variety of scales that would be able to set up a dialogue between these two domains. Yeah? There are three of them actually. The first one was the one you see in the pictures right now, which is the geoscope, a series of large-scale spherical representations of the Earth that should have been placed all around the world and wired with a number of electric bulbs, lights, in order to visualize datascapes. The most important should have been placed opposite the United Nations in New York, as the sketch on the right shows. But that never really materialized. What did materialize are a series of more human scale ones, such as the one on the top left, that were built mainly in American university. Only one was built in Europe at the University of Nottingham, actually. And through this device, of course, a different, if you like, sensibility, design sensibility towards the Earth could have emerged. The second one is the game itself, only partially played at New York University in 1969, in which the different datascapes should have been used as a starting point for a dialogue and a mediation between different groups in order to try to achieve, as I said earlier, world peace. And the final one was connected to the word game. The Buckminster Fuller first design for the Montreal World Expo in 1967, which was different from what ended up being built, and consisted of a word game map unrolled and framed by a piece of architecture itself that was conceived actually as a viewing, but also as a measuring device for these data. So in this particular case, we see a very interesting relationship between architecture, data, images, and their abstraction, all based on this shift in the basically the scope and horizon of the technology endowed. Like I said, it's only one of the many examples, and I think that the main part of the talk will focus on much earlier work that was touched upon in a different way yesterday on Alberti, and it was mentioned also by Emmanuelle in the introduction, the work that takes place in the Renaissance, in which architecture again is used as a computational device, both as a subject and an object of investigation of the world. And in the Sant'Andrea in Mantova, Alberti already shows how architecture could be used as a computational device itself by adding this odd window. Just above is more classical treatment of the facade, which should have let light through the church, and on a particular day light up the crypt of Sant'Andrea. Or, of course, in the Costruzione Legittima in the first examples of Costruzione Legittima in Brunelleschi. So again, here we have architecture used directly as a mediation between the world of numbers and the actual physical world, through the world, of course, through the lenses of geometry. The world of architecture and city themselves have often been used as computational device through the mechanism of the memory palace, or in this particular images of, we could call it, of the memory city, in which, of course, memory is offloaded, is delegated onto the very structure of an imaginary city, in which the function, position, and arrangement of individual buildings can be used as a way to store, if you like, information in the city itself, and use the actual act of walking through the roads and the buildings of this imaginary city as a way to reanimate memory and recollect a number of notions. It is, of course, a quite interesting concept of the city, almost as a database, if we wanted to describe it as in common terminology. And in this particular case, the act of walking through it being, of course, a virtual act, being almost the algorithm for it, the way of reweaving a number of notions, reweaving them together. The city as an invariant, and perhaps the way in which we use it as a variable mobile way of reading it, is an interesting, I think, concept again that resonates, funnily enough, with the way in which we play with machine learning and large data sets, in which again this apparently infinite knowledge is actually very finite and contained at any given time we look at it. So in a way, very similar to certain examples coming from the Renaissance. And we also know that the promise behind the memory palaces was the construction of a clavis universalis, a language that would unlock the mysteries of the world. In this dialogue between images and abstraction, of course, the key example where we always refer back to is Ramon Lull's Ars, developed mainly in the 13th century, which is a form of computation, if you like, without images, in which the rotations of a number of concentric wheels begins to produce a number of statements, and in a more complex fashion actually to change the nature of the statements itself between being subjects or predicates, and is based on a reduction of knowledge into its most fundamental and minimal components, and then on a basic mechanization of the way in which these elements can be combined in order to generate, if you like, one of the first examples of combinatorial explosions. This again is a term we use today. Of course, Lull did not use this terminology. Lull himself found difficulties with this combinatorial explosion, and quite quickly had to start to curtail the results of his own investigation and begin to eliminate a number of combinations of letters that could have produced statements that were in contradiction with his own metaphysics. This is a quite important point because, as Umberto Eco has, I think, correctly pointed out, what we could say is that Lull's system is fundamentally a system to answer a question that is already known with an answer that is already known with an infinite or an infinite number of ways, or let's say at least in the most varied number of ways. And as such, it implies, of course, the presence of only one language, of one form of metaphysical thought, and for that reason, it cannot be really considered to be a very interesting example for mnemotechniques and their potential in the light of the problems we face today. Nevertheless, of course, certain elements are very important to point out. Of course, it's a purely intellectual apprehension of reality, and it uses purely intellectual means to recombine this reality. And of course, is not the subject of the talk today, but we all know that Lullism had an immense power in affecting the history of European culture for at least 4 centuries. But the example I think that remains quite interesting in this history is that of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who of course is mostly known for his Oratio, but also I'd like to point your attention towards one of his later
writings, which is the Heptaplus, which is an account of the genesis of the world. But here we have an interesting conversations between images and abstraction. The influence of Lull on Pico is, of course, well documented, and the fascination of playing with, if you like, basic mathematical principles in order to grasp, to rip the mask off things and let them reveal their true meaning, was, of course, an incredible fascination of the time, one that was going hand in hand with magic, no? The possibility to have a certain power over nature. But some things are interesting, and I will now straddle between the Heptaplus and the Oratio, and I will never say when I'm talking about which, but I can, in questions, perhaps explain more precisely the sources of these arguments. But the first point is that, of course, Pico starts from a different point of view. There is no one truth, there is no one language. There can only be multiple truths and multiple languages. And if we want to discuss these problems philosophically, well, then we have to be able to be literal. They have a certain degree, of literacy in these three, in these different versions of truths and languages. And we know, of course, that for Pico there were three: Latin, Greek, and of course the Hebrew. And with that, of course, the role of Kabbalistic tradition had a very important role. Of course, in the final part of the Heptaplus, we have the description in which through combinatorial mutation of the Bereshit, we have a series of other words that begin to be produced, and with that, I'm sorry for I think the software translation slightly scrambled the words on the right, so I apologize for that. But what is quite interesting here is that combinatorial variations in Pico no longer delivers an answer that could have been already anticipated almost before the game had played, but begins to actually open up domains that are new, or let's say explore domains whose knowledge on is not entirely in control. So the difference, again, I'm referring to Umberto Eco here, is of course that Lull wanted to demonstrate credible things, credible truths, and Pico here was actually after incredible, unheard things. And as such, of course, the description by Pico of man as a divine chameleon is very interesting, because rather than the description of this period of philosophical investigation in the Renaissance as a quite often characterized as a static one, we have a very different view that comes out of these investigations. Of course, the divine chameleon needs to navigate the universe, a universe that is now open, that is no longer confined within a very finite and tight boundaries, and one in which, of course, the act of negotiations become much more important. Of course, Cusano had already spoken of the universe as a circle of infinite radius and therefore of no center. So in this particular form of combinatorial logic, we have an act of learning embedded in it, which is different from the combinatorial games played by Lull. And Eco concludes that man, therefore, through this little passage, Pico shows how man can construct his own world, and runs on the vertigo of the possible and accepting the risks that come from walking on this edge. So the act of negotiating the man that comes from this way of thinking is very, I think, important, and and fundamentally gives us a slightly different way to think about the act of mnemotechniques, its combinatorial logic, and also still sits within the intellectual tradition set up by Pico. I just want to say that these are interesting topics also in relationship to the notion of Europe, because, as we know, and again, Massimo Cacciari here is quite important in foregrounding these notions. Pico himself was driven by a large concerns about what was happening in Europe in the 15th century. Of course, we know that 1953 Constantinople had fallen, that Spain, of course, had Spain and Portugal saw the Moors and the Jewish community abandoning that culture, and as a result, Pico, and here is mostly really the work on the Oratio, thought of a philosophical way to retable conversations between these different cultures, and of course with the ambition, perhaps as we heard yesterday, perhaps not really ever achievable, but an ambition of a concordia or even a pax universalis within Europe. But this act, philosophically, what is very interesting is the fact that somehow Pico refuses the idea of the single identity, one that perhaps he doesn't believe to be philosophically possible, perhaps only militarily possible. He doesn't seem to be looking for just a juxtaposition of different identities, a collage, if you like, of differences, but rather thinks of the fact that these three different cultures he deals with in the Oratio try to answer fundamentally similar questions in different ways, and therefore the act of translating and negotiating seems to become a philosophically viable way for achieving concordia. Right. I think that time-wise I will skip this part where we also have work at the larger scale to concentrate on the final of the three examples I wanted to discuss about this relationship between mnemotechnics and space. And it's a work of Giulio Camillo in L'idea del teatro, published in 1540. Camillo here, I'd like to almost present him as a conjunction between the tradition of the memory palace and that of Lull. We know through Gerolamo Ruscelli that Giulio Camillo was aware of, actually knew very well the work of Lullo, and we also know that he knew the work of Pico, although only few passages in his work show a direct comment on the work of Pico. We also know that Giulio Camillo had worked with combinatorial logics to write love letters, as the poem to Lucrezia shows here. But of course, what I'd like to talk about is the theater, based on a 7x7 grid organized through planets and gates, through which knowledge could be then positioned within the locations emerge from this geometrical act of dividing basically all knowledge into a 7x7 grid. Topical logic, that is the rationale for placing knowledge in specific locations, was at the center of Camillo's idea of the theater, and of course in that act we have the first convergence between images and the abstraction of Lull, but also Camillo goes beyond that and begins to devise ways in which this topical logic can morph and move basically between the cells of this grid. The act of movement, of course, is a metamorphic act which promises to reveal once again the deep secret behind the knowledge stored. It's an inversion of the theater, we know that. We also know that it begins to play between the closeness of the database. We know that Camillo bases on a finite number of objects that would constitute this theater, and no extra object is required to know the mysteries of the universe. So again, similar to the databases of today, we play with a very distinct and finite set of data, if we want to call them that way. But it's also an open system through topical logic that allows basically morphing within itself. The use of the word theater has to do with the act of making visible all this knowledge, and from this comes the famous quote which I have translated with some licenses to make the title of this lecture today, which is Magna Mentem Extra Nos, which is the idea that human thought can be externalized and displayed in front of an audience, which in this case sits on the stage of this classical theater. Of course, all this, the combination of all these acts begins to operate as a creative machine, if you like, for the production of new knowledge. So it plays between different kinds of domains as it operates in a multimedia, if you like, fashion. We have the books selected by Camillo, but these books are anatomically dissected and redistributed within particular chests of drawers that will populate the seats of the theater. Camillo himself had been involved in some anatomical experiments as well, and the idea is the device that allows this theater to work is the so-called artificio artifice, in which a series of mechanisms allows for the morphing of the knowledge, but also the not just the dissection of the texts, but the presentation, if you like, of the very structure of this text, something that could have been learned from and used to produce new pieces of work. 201 drawings at some point were part of a version of the idea of the teatro. This version of the idea teatro was lost in a fire, and these drawings were all by Titian, who was a close friend of Camillo. And of course, like I said, the idea of the artificial and metamorphosis have to do also with a series of more abstracted devices, which probably are definitely reminiscent of Lull's ones, a series of wheels that could have been spun in order to activate the knowledge stored in the teatro. The only recipient of all Sebastiano Serlio's belongings was Giulio Camillo. In 1528, Serlio writes his testament, although he would die much later, but in the testament everything is left to Giulio Camillo. And the relationship between the two is, of course, one of very important, or great importance for architecture, not only because the structure of Serlio's book is based on Camillo's theater. The 7 columns are transformed into 7 books, but most importantly, perhaps because the idea that that architecture could be systematized within a finite set of elements that were directly coming from the classical tradition and recombined in a variety of ways in order to produce new architecture is pretty much the one of the key elements of Serlio's books, and one that again resonates quite well with certain preoccupations that we still have today when we work with these concepts. So in a way, the database is again closed and finite, and somehow the act of dissecting through it begins to return slightly different outcomes according to the criteria with which we operate. And in a way, again, the mix of rhetorics and rhetorics, if you like, is interesting here because it begins to depict and output different kinds of images. So somehow the how is the what in this particular kind of work. Now, I just want to very, very quickly perhaps show more, maybe this one, more recent works developed at the Bartlett, not just because I think it's interesting to see how some of these conversations begin to play again today, of course, in a very different, in a different environment. We, like I said throughout the talk, we still have the same notions of a finite data set, a very close data set, even if these data sets can change over time. At any given point, their size is a finite, a discrete one, and that is, again, quite interesting, almost gives them a classical tone. And again, the way in which we dissect through them begins to return different kind of images, and the play between images and abstraction still remains, as architecture, after all, is an applied art. I think that perhaps today what begins to be quite different is that the hierarchical systems that we use to structure these dissections through data are very different. They lack perhaps all the linearity of the work that we saw in the 14th century, and in fact they don't seem to lend themselves to any form of hierarchical classification. So architecture and urban design have been concerned since the end of World War II with words such as top-down and bottom-up, but neither of these two seem to be satisfactory in describing the kind of data clusterization that emerges from this machine thinking. And with that, I think also the notion of parametrics, the notion of some sort of ideal entity that can be instantiated, seems to no longer have much traction in describing how we can dissect through data, with algorithms. So I think that I'll leave it maybe to that, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you very much for this lecture. I think we will skip coffee and go to questions because, again, there are a lot of very interesting lines here. Please, are there questions?
Thank you very much. This was wonderful. I have one main, well, I would be very interested in hearing how you think about this. So with this combination of syncretism as a kind of a method of reconciling different beliefs, basically, different communities, and its relation to algebra and to computer. Now, this is very strong, and I very, very much agree. But what I'm really concerned with is how then to think of the referent of such reconciliation. So who is minding something outside of ourselves? How are you thinking of that? How can one address this?
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. Yes. Well, what I think it's first of all, what I'm trying to do through the talk is retable some of these questions for which I'm not sure I have a fully fledged answer to myself. So in that sense, I think that there are some questions I think that are interesting out of these examples. One is a problem of literacy. Yeah, we know that that is an interesting topic to discuss, and I think that, for instance, the widening of the sources, the greater understanding with which Pico, for instance, took in a greater cultural references, basically, is of interest. And it's something that, although, like I said, I'm not sure I have a fully prepared answer to, seems anyway an avenue through which we should perhaps work more. And this is one element. Another element that is interesting is, I think that, and that is perhaps a more tentative answer to your question. I think it's quite interesting, the idea that there is a set of invariants, and there are ways of mobilizing them. And again, I hope this came through here and there in the talk. And that, I think, is a way to make them public. How? Because I thought, if I understood your question correctly, I thought, how do we gain traction through this action? That I don't think I have a clear ideas of how, that could work. Yeah.
Other questions, remarks? So I try. It's as you are an educator, really maybe just a question on how it is that you bring this extremely rich tradition alive in how you transmit to your students, and how is it that it actually inhabits and populates this last example that you show us and the many more that you help them produce.
Yeah. Okay. The first point is the let's say what I said at the beginning, the idea of shifting the domain of what could be understood as design. I think that is one of the main challenges that we ought to work on, because it's got to be a design problem. It is a design problem. And so the pictures of the Earth at greater scale, the ability to think of our intervention on the planet counted in millennia rather than in days, are, I think, the potentiality that come out of this work. And by this work, I mean the conflation of both where we are now and the history that took us here. So that, both of them constitute, I think, a design agenda which, in one way or another, I'd like to discuss, let's say, in other forums. So those two are the main elements. Then there are other things which I didn't talk about today, but for instance, I think that the mathematical, what in mathematics is called rewriting, begins to be a very alluring prospect of thinking, to think about these concepts. So the idea that through process of substitutions, they can be more or less complex. We can begin to sort of unpack and create a dialogue between the abstraction of certain world and the non-abstract nature of design, which ultimately is a non-abstract domain. I think is a very interesting way to think about it. And again, to try to address your question more tightly, it's quite useful for me to think about this concept because they are very easily generating a series of problematics just out of their own genealogy. And this is something, again, that is useful to think about at least at two levels, yeah? On a pedagogical level, but also if you go one level up, I think it's sort of useful to have these conversations when it comes to what we call digital architecture, to give it a broad label. Yeah.
One comment on this, and then there is another question. through what you explain or how you explain and raise the question of design now, I think there is a self-similar manner of addressing exactly this kind of reference. No, because what you're saying. So, how to put it? Maybe one formulation that a friend, Elias, who is going to speak tomorrow, actually. So he told the students in one of the courses, you know, if you appreciate abstraction and still want to work concretely, if you want to solve a problem, you have to create a bigger problem within which you can resolve the one that you had before. Yeah? And then there is a kind of an escalation, there is a kind of a sedimentation which brings forth, in a way, what is capable to solve or to reconcile the things that didn't fit where one is coming from. And I didn't mean to expose a difficult question before. I really think your lecture was so beautiful in pointing to something like that. Something, for me, this is the cryptographic, but I'm so interested in the cryptographic now.
But the cryptography is an art of negotiating and translating, but not necessarily. It's an open one. It's one that needs to be designed, and also, it's got other let's say strands that have to do with the relationship between syntax and semantics, which they are in the background of some of these talks. The question wasn't difficult. It's just nice to think about it.
One comment on this possibility of reconciliation between language and space, or computation and space, it is that if you take natural languages, they are always one-dimensional. They are linear. And this is because they come from spoken languages. And speech is in time, and time is one-dimensional. So this is why our natural languages are one-dimensional. But if you take the formal languages that we use in logic or in computer science, they don't need to be one-dimensional. And for instance, you have 1D Turing machines with 1D tapes, but you also have Turing machines with 2D tapes, or maybe Turing machine with 3D tapes, and so on. And the example that you took, rewriting, is very relevant because you can rewrite all kinds of expressions in languages such as words, trees, graphs, even geometric figures. And if we start investigating these 2D languages that includes the architecture drawing, then we have a link between at least 2D space or 3D space and what we call a language in other areas.
Yes, I mean, I take it more as a comment and an encouragement, and I only agree. I also, obviously, these, as you rightly pointed out, these they are letters, but they are not really letters. They are numbers camouflaged under letters, and the reasons may also having to do with the practicalities of 15th century's calculus, or the lack of it, we should say. So yes, I completely agree. Also, I think again, I wanted to pause on this image, as I also think that the abstraction and let's say spatial representation of it is more problematic than perhaps at sometimes I may sound like. And this image is of course highly abstract. You can't say it's a figurative image by any chance. So I think these problems are a part of these conversations. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions?
Thank you very much for this very rich presentation, and with the connections in between today and the ancient mnemotechnics. A question that would be very interesting also to pose for me would be the relationship in between literacy and embodiment. Because this, the first use of the memory balances in a way included the somatic experience as a mind state. So perhaps it would be a way of interrogation to include also the embodied experience inside the schematic representations of space.
Yes, it is, of course, I think that the talk in a way sides slightly on the intellectual tradition. We know that Pico's ideas were almost suddenly outdated by the arrival of Tommaso Campanella, in a sense that in a way he found a challenge to his own ideas quite quickly, and Campanella, just to say, that replaces books with nature, and for that reason changes the whole game. But to go back to your question, I think that it is a personal liking, so it's hard to fight against myself, in the sense that I just like the intellectual dimension of this world, and perhaps this bias somehow comes across by siding myself more with a certain kind of investigation. But that doesn't exclude, I think, your point, the point you're trying to raise. And I still think that the part that fascinates me the most is this idea of dissecting a certain body in a certain way. So in that sense, the data itself, perhaps with a more metaphorical reading of it, could be understood as a body that can reveal itself in different ways according to the logics through which we can dissect it.
In relation to what you have mentioned now, the dissection, have you also thoughts about the relation between the act of dissecting and how the act of dissecting changes or transforms what you are trying to capture, or what you are trying to dissect?
Yes. I mean that is what I'm trying to say. That the two are not to be seen separate. That obviously, and the very fact that a certain technological apparatus endows a certain description of the world, again, the two are to be seen together in a sort of dialogue. So, of course, the means through which, I mean, yesterday's the Descriptio Urbis Romae is a great example of that. The means through which space is computed determines what space is. And in more recent terms, others, such as Lev Manovich, for instance, have stated, but I think it doesn't have to be just Lev Manovich, stated that the database can only tell you what the database can tell you. Yeah. So there's a kind of relationship between the two that cannot be separated.
So unless we have one more question, we take 3 minutes break.